Hi everyone, it's John Mitchell. Welcome back to the exam preparation series, and this is our second video. So let's get into it. Today's question takes us to the 2011 exam. Just before we start, just remember, don't try and memorize the answers. Look at how they've been answered, how they've actually answered the question and where others went wrong. Because if you try and regurgitate answers, as I said in the first video, the case studies will be different, the scenarios will be different. So even if the question's the same or similar, the answer is most likely going to be different. So here is today's question. Many large-scale organisations use a multi-stage planning process in order to achieve their objectives. Explain each of the steps in this process. So if we follow on from what we did in the first video, where we circle the descriptive terms and then underline the content, so this is what we'll end up with. So if we need to, this is a pretty straightforward question in all honesty. All we need to do is explain each of the steps in the process. So it's just an explain question. And the content, what are we explaining? We're explaining a multi-stage planning process. So really, it's a really straightforward question, and believe it or not, this is worth 5 marks. And it's not that often that you get a really straightforward explain question worth so many marks. So really, if you knew the content, then these are really free marks. And this is where you can jump ahead of a lot of the people doing the exam, because this is what is written in the examiner's report. And again, we like to thank the people from the VCE for putting out the examiner's report, because they provide really useful information. And this is what they've said. Many students struggled with this question, believe it or not, even though it is simply explain. Some students confuse the question with the levels of planning. So strategic, tactical and operational, they're the levels of planning. While that was, and we even accepted that year. So while this was accepted, it required students to show that there was a process, and that's where students struggled. So even if they did strategic, tactical and operational, which essentially is wrong, because so many students did it, it was allowed, but you had to show that there was an actual process from that long-term, medium-term and short-term planning. While others discussed SMART principles, which is not a planning process. It's fine to use the SMART principles when you're talking about planning, but that's not a process. Essentially, that all the SMART principles does is talk about setting the objectives, which is the first which is the first step in the process. So it really says how to set the objective. It needs to be specific, measurable, etc., etc. But that is not a planning process. So essentially what's happened here is that students haven't known the content. Now the reason I chose this question is because this often happens where students struggle planning so big, they go, well, what do I actually have to do in planning? Is it the stages of planning or the planning process, which is essentially the same thing? Or is it the levels of planning? So it's important that you can differentiate between those two. So let's have a look at the answer. Remember, don't regurgitate this answer, but let's have a look at how they actually did it. So first of all, they've really defined planning. Planning refers to defining objectives and determining strategies to achieve those objectives. And the planning process consists of 5 steps. So that's how they've opened up their answer. So automatically they've gone, well, this is worth 5 marks. I've got a 5-step planning process. I'll go through the 5 steps. And what I've got in red here is essentially the step, and then in blue you can see that this is where they've started to explain. So they haven't just listed the 5 steps, they've actually explained the 5 steps, because that's what the question asks to do. So the first step is to define objectives, which involves outlining, and that's where you see which involves, they're explaining what's involved in that step, outlining what the organisation wants to achieve compared to competitors and where in the market it wants to be. The next step is to outline the facts. So we've got 2 steps now. This is done by, again, they are explaining. Analysing the environment can be done using a SWOT analysis. Consists of determining and examining the organisation's internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. So clearly, as I'm reading this, I know that they understand the content so far, because they have listed the step and they've explained each one. So step 3, develop alternative strategies, which means determine possible ways of achieving objectives, for example, new policies, rewards and training. So you can see there again, they've listed the step and also explained. Then it requires management to select and implement one strategy, which is step 4. This involves, again, they use that term, this involves identifying the most appropriate strategy that is most effective and putting it into action, finally, the last step is to monitor and evaluate the strategy. So again, that's the fifth step, deciding if objectives are being met and taking corrective action if not. So that's their explanation. So it's a really straightforward question, but just keep in mind that there's a difference between the levels of planning and the stages of planning or a planning process. So just to recap, a process, and this isn't just for planning, but a process, if you see the term process, it means steps. So whether that's a policy development process where you go through steps there, or a planning process and you go through steps there. Planning so the term planning has levels and also a process today, or slash stages. So if you see the stages of planning or a planning process, that's what it means, what we went through today. And just to keep in mind that the levels actually mean strategic, tactical and operational. You might have some different terms there. I think the other three are, what are they? Strategic, operational and frontline or something like that. You may have learnt them. Means exactly the same thing. So and the process or the stages these are the ones we go through. It doesn't have to be specific to these, it's just got to be a logical sort of 5 steps, because the actual planning process isn't specified in the study design. It says that you need to know a process, but it doesn't specify the 5 steps. So as long as it's a logical 5 steps in what you would go through in planning, that's fine. So the most common one is to set the objective, analyse the current environments, develop alternatives, select and implement those alternatives, and then monitor your results. Okay, so that is video 2 done. So to access more resources to help you with your exam, including the practice exams that we've written and the practice SACs, then come on over to teachingbubble.com.